Production note: do not read aloud. This is a work of complete fiction created solely for entertainment purposes. All characters, locations, organizations, and events are entirely fictional. Any resemblance to real persons, living or dead, or actual events is purely coincidental. Victor Calloway straightened his bow tie in the mirror of his Mayfair penthouse and laughed, actually laughed, at the photograph his assistant had just sent him. It was Amelia, his wife of 8 years, standing outside their Kensington apartment in her old wool coat, carrying grocery bags like someone's forgotten housekeeper. He forwarded it to Scarlett with a single caption. "She still has no idea. Sad, honestly." Scarlett replied with 3 laughing emojis. Victor pocketed his phone, picked up his champagne, and headed out the door to meet the woman London already believed was his future wife. If you've ever been the person someone was ashamed of, this story is for you. Stay until the end and drop a like, then comment with the name of the city where you're watching. I want to see how far this story travels. The morning it all came apart began like most mornings in the Hart Calloway household, which is to say it began with absence. Amelia woke at 7:30 to an empty bed, which was not unusual. Victor left early most days, or he didn't come home at all, and she had long since stopped asking which it would be. The indentation on his side of the mattress was cold. She pressed her palm flat against the sheet anyway, a habit she hadn't managed to break, and stared up at the ceiling for a moment before swinging her legs over the side of the bed. The apartment was quiet in the way that only very large, very empty spaces can be quiet, the kind of silence that has weight to it, that settles on your shoulders and follows you room to room. It was a nice apartment. Victor had chosen it, as he'd chosen most things in their life. The furniture, the neighborhood, the curtains that she'd once tried to replace with something warmer and he'd had taken back to the shop without telling her. She made coffee and sat down at her desk. There was a manuscript waiting, a French novel she'd been translating for 3 weeks, a slow and melancholy story about a woman returning to her childhood village after a long time away. Her editor at Hargrove Press had given her until Friday. She opened the document, found her place, and stared at the sentence she'd been wrestling with for 2 days. Elle ne reconnaissait plus rien, et pourtant tout lui semblait familier. She no longer recognized anything, and yet everything felt familiar. She typed a version, deleted it, typed another. That was when her phone buzzed. It was a news alert, which she almost ignored. She was not, in the way Victor was, someone who tracked the movements of London's social calendar with any particular attention. She went to events when she was required to and disappeared from them as quickly as she could manage. But the name of the charity in the headline caught her eye, the Ashford Foundation Winter Gala, because Victor had attended that event 2 weeks ago. He'd told her it was a work obligation, boring, full of people she wouldn't know. He'd come home at 2 in the morning smelling of good wine. She tapped the alert. It opened to a society column in the London Illustrated, one of those glossy online publications that lived and died on photographs of wealthy people at fundraising dinners. She scrolled past the headline and into the photo gallery, and there was Victor, her husband, unmistakably her husband, in his dark evening suit, the one she'd helped him choose 3 years ago at a tailor on Savile Row. He was standing near the edge of a crowded ballroom, and he was not alone. The woman beside him was extraordinary looking. That was the first thing Amelia registered, before anything else. Tall, with dark auburn hair swept up in an elaborate arrangement, wearing a deep emerald gown that fit like it had been built specifically for her body. She was laughing at something Victor was saying, her head tilted back, her hand resting on his chest with the easy familiarity of someone who had rested it there many times before. Victor's arm was around her waist, not around her shoulders, not a polite hand at the small of her back. Fully around her waist, pulling her in, the way you hold someone who belongs to you. Amelia read the caption twice. Financial executive Victor Calloway and celebrity lifestyle influencer Scarlett Vale continue to be London's most watched couple. The pair arrived together at the Ashford Foundation Winter Gala, with inside sources confirming wedding plans are well underway. Calloway, 44, reportedly began divorce proceedings earlier this year. She set the phone down on the desk. She looked at it for a moment. Then she picked it up and read the caption again, in case she had somehow misread it. She hadn't. Divorce proceedings earlier this year. She looked around the apartment, at the curtains Victor had chosen, at the bookshelf she'd arranged and rearranged 3 times because she had nothing else to do with her afternoons, at the framed print above the fireplace, that she'd never liked and had never said so. 8 years of a life that had apparently, at some point she couldn't identify, quietly ended without her being informed. She didn't cry. She would cry later, in the bathroom, with the tap running, hunched over the sink in a way she would be embarrassed about for weeks afterward. But in that first moment, sitting at her translation desk with the unfinished French sentence still on the screen, what she felt was not grief. It was something older and colder than grief. It was the particular humiliation of realizing you have been the last person to know something that everyone else already understood. She knew who Scarlet Vale was in the vague way that you know the name of someone who exists in a world slightly adjacent to yours. Scarlet had built an audience of several million followers across social platforms by documenting what she called her elevated life: interiors, fashion, restaurant openings, weekend trips to estates in the Cotswolds. She was 31 or 32, Amelia thought. She had a very specific aesthetic, everything curated to look effortless, nothing actually effortless about any of it. Amelia had scrolled past her content occasionally without any particular feeling about it. Now she sat on the floor of her living room with her laptop open and read everything she could find. There were photographs going back 18 months. Not all of them included Victor by name. But once Amelia knew to look for him, she found him in the backgrounds of Scarlet's post, a familiar jaw in a restaurant booth, a sleeve she recognized at what appeared to be a private members club. He had been careful. He had been in the background, cropped out, slightly out of focus. But he had also apparently stopped being careful at some point in the last few months, because more recent photographs showed him clearly. A holiday somewhere in the Mediterranean, the two of them on a yacht. A dinner at what looked like a Michelin-starred restaurant. That gala. Scarlett's comment sections were full of people congratulating her. So happy for you both. He's gorgeous. When's the wedding? She had responded to some of them with heart emojis and one that said, patience, patience. Amelia sat very still and looked at the screen. There was a specific kind of pain in discovering that your humiliation has been public. Not just that your husband has been lying to you, that was its own wound, but that other people have been watching and commenting and congratulating the woman he replaced you with, while you sat in a Kensington apartment translating novels and not knowing. The betrayal was one thing. The spectacle was another. The spectacle was what made it hard to breathe. She closed the laptop. She made herself another cup of coffee. She drank it standing at the kitchen window, looking out at the gray December street, and thought about what to do. Her first instinct was to call Victor, to hear him explain or try to have the confrontation that the situation seemed to require, the accusations, the denials, the tears on both sides, the scene that would feel at least like doing something. But she stood there with the coffee cooling in her hands, and she thought about the caption. Divorce proceedings earlier this year. If that was true, then Victor had already made his decision. Any confrontation she initiated now would only give him the advantage. He'd know she knew. He'd have his lawyers ready. He'd move her along whatever timeline he'd already prepared for her. She was not going to be moved along his timeline. She set down the coffee mug, picked up her phone, and called her friend Priya. Priya Nair had been Amelia's closest friend since their postgraduate years at UCL, where they'd both been doing research degrees in comparative literature and both been surviving on bad coffee and cheaper wine. Priya had since become a solicitor, not a divorce solicitor. She specialized in intellectual property. But she knew enough to know what questions to ask and who to refer Amelia to. She arrived at the apartment 40 minutes after Amelia called her, still in her work clothes, carrying 2 paper bags from the bakery on the corner. She came in, took one look at Amelia's face and said, "Tell me everything." Amelia told her everything. She showed Priya the photographs, the article, Scarlet's social media. Priya sat across the kitchen table and looked at all of it with the expression of someone trying very hard to remain professionally composed while being personally outraged. "How long do you think this has been going on?" Priya asked. "At least 18 months. That's how far back I can find photographs." "Have you spoken to him?" "No." Priya looked at her carefully. "Are you going to?" "Not yet." Amelia folded her hands on the table. "I want to know what I'm dealing with first. All of it. Before he knows I know." Priya nodded slowly. "That's smart. Do you have access to your joint accounts?" "I have access to the household account. Victor manages the rest. You need to find out what the rest looks like. I can recommend someone, a financial investigator. She's discreet and thorough. And you need a family law solicitor. Today, ideally. Can you recommend one of those two? I can. She's very good and she doesn't take prisoners. Priya paused. Amelia, I need to ask you something and I need you to answer honestly. Go ahead. Did you have any idea? Any suspicion at all? Amelia looked at the table for a moment. I knew something was wrong. For a long time. He was distant. He'd been distant for years, really. He traveled constantly. He had dinners and events he never invited me to. He talked about me in this way when he did talk about me like I was... She stopped. Like I was a footnote. Something in the background. He'd say things sometimes, little things, about how I wasn't comfortable in social situations, or how his colleagues' wives had certain expectations I didn't quite meet. I thought that was just how he was. Critical. I thought it was about me. It was never about you. I know that now. Amelia looked up. But I spent 8 years thinking it was. Priya reached across the table and put her hand over Amelia's. She didn't say anything, which was one of the reasons Amelia had called her first. What Amelia did next, she did methodically. She was, by nature, an organized person. It was part of what made her good at translation work. The ability to hold large, complex structures in her head, to track the through lines, to notice when something didn't fit. She applied that same quality to her own marriage with a kind of cold precision that surprised her a little. Grief, she discovered, is easier to carry when you give it something to do. She opened a notebook, a plain black one from the drawer where she kept her working notes, and she started making lists. What she knew, what she suspected, what she needed to find out. She thought back through the last several years, cataloging things she had filed away and not examined. Business trips that seemed longer than necessary, a password change on a shared laptop that Victor explained as a security update, a dinner reservation confirmation that appeared in his email when she was using the computer, and that he explained. When she asked, as a client entertaining obligation, he'd forgotten to mention. She had accepted all of these explanations without much resistance, and she recognized now that she had done so not because the explanations were convincing, but because she had not wanted to look more closely. Because looking more closely felt like an accusation, and making accusations felt like exactly the kind of woman Victor had always implied she was in danger of becoming. Insecure, difficult, not sophisticated enough to understand how a man in his position operated. She had let him make her afraid of her own instincts. That realization settled in her chest like a stone. She contacted the financial investigator Priya recommended, a woman named Claire Benton, who operated out of an unremarkable office in Clerkenwell, and who, upon their first meeting, asked Amelia to describe her husband's financial habits with the brisk efficiency of someone who had heard every version of this story before and found none of them surprising. Joint assets? Claire asked. The apartment is jointly owned. We have a joint bank account for household expenses. Everything else is in his name. Do you have any sense of the scale of his personal assets? He earns very well, I know that, but I've never had visibility into the specifics. She paused. He always said he preferred to handle the finances, that it was easier that way. Claire wrote something in her notebook. It usually is, she said, for the person doing the handling. Over the next 10 days, Claire Benton began to surface information, not all at once. It came in pieces, each one landing with the weight of a new evidence of a life that had been hidden in plain sight. Victor had 3 personal bank accounts that Amelia had not known existed. He had a credit card she had no access to, with a payment history that told its own story. A jeweler in Mayfair, a florist in Chelsea, a boutique hotel in the Maldives, a luxury villa rental in Provence dated to a week when he'd told Amelia he was at a conference in Frankfurt. There was a storage unit in Battersea rented under a holding company, which Claire had not yet been able to access, but which had been active for at least 3 years. And then there were the messages. Claire had not obtained them through any means Amelia chose to ask about too carefully. But somehow, an exchange from Victor's secondary email account made its way into the folder Claire sent her on a Tuesday morning, and Amelia opened it and read it at her desk while her half-finished translation waited on the screen beside it. The messages were to a friend of Victor's. a man named Jonathan, who worked at the same investment firm and who appeared to serve as something between a confidant and an audience. There were dozens of them, going back 2 years. Victor wrote to Jonathan the way men write when they think they are unobserved, with a casual cruelty that was worse in its way than anger would have been. She spent the whole dinner talking to the caterer. I almost died. Scarlett knows every person in that room by name. Amelia would have spent the night in the corner with a book if I'd brought her. She's not bad, she's just ordinary, you know? Fundamentally, stubbornly ordinary. I outgrew it. And then from 6 months ago, solicitor says 18 months minimum if she contests, trying to structure it so she doesn't get enough information to make that worthwhile. Keep it clean. She won't fight, she's not that type. Amelia read that last one 3 times. She won't fight, she's not that type. She closed the laptop. She sat in the quiet apartment for a long time. Then she opened it again, opened a new document beside her translation, and began to make a different kind of list. She had a meeting with the family law solicitor, Diana Marsh, sharp-faced and efficient in a way that immediately inspired confidence, later that same week. Diana reviewed what Claire had already found and told Amelia, with the calm delivery of someone used to devastating people with information, that Victor's financial structuring was consistent with someone who had been preparing for divorce for some time. He's been moving assets, Diana said. Some of it is through the holding company, some through instruments that are technically legal, but will look very bad to a judge once we demonstrate intent. How much do you know about the original financial arrangements when you married? Not enough, Amelia said. Then we'll need to go back and reconstruct. It will take time. Diana looked at her over the reading glasses. I want to be honest with you about what we're dealing with. He's had a head start, but a head start isn't the same as a winning position. I'm not in a hurry, Amelia said. Diana raised an eyebrow slightly. I mean it, Amelia said. I want to do this right. I want everything, and I want it to hold. Diana looked at her for a moment with an expression that might have been, in another context, approval. Good, she said. Then let's get to work. She did not know in that period whether what she was doing could be called grief. She missed something, but she spent a fair amount of time trying to identify what exactly she missed. And the honest answer was that she missed the idea of the marriage more than the marriage itself. She missed the safety of believing she had a partner. She missed the years, more than anything, 8 years of her life spent managing herself to fit the shape of someone who had found her ordinary. She had made herself smaller. She had swallowed her opinions at dinner parties and smiled at his colleagues and not asked about the trips, and the question she kept returning to, alone in the apartment at night, was not why he had done it, but why she had allowed it for so long. That question didn't have a clean answer. It rarely does. What she did, instead of sitting with the question, was keep moving. She called her editor at Hargrove Press and asked if there was additional work available. There was always more work than translators to do it. She took on a second project, a contemporary Spanish novel with a faster deadline and more demanding prose. She started working longer hours. She got up earlier. She also, somewhat to her own surprise, signed up for an etiquette and social training course that ran through a firm in Belgravia that catered to diplomatic families and executives preparing for international posting. Victor had spent 8 years implying in his careful, plausibly deniable way that she lacked the social fluency for his world. She had believed him. She was now going to test that belief with some actual evidence. The instructor was a former diplomat's wife named Henrietta Voss, who was in her late 60s, had impeccable posture, and seemed to operate on the assumption that any problem of presentation or behavior was essentially a problem of insufficient practice. She corrected Amelia's table manners on the first day and her handshake on the second, and by the third week had moved on to the specifics of navigating complex social hierarchies in high-pressure formal settings. The goal, Henrietta said in one of their early sessions, is not performance. The goal is presence. You cannot perform your way into a room. You can only be in it. What's the difference? Amelia asked. When you perform, people feel the effort. When you're present, they feel you. Henrietta looked at her with the blunt assessment of someone who has spent a long time watching people try and fail to be things they're not. You have the intelligence, you have the education, you have the instinct. I can see it. What you've been doing for some time, I suspect, is hiding all three. Amelia looked at the table. Stop doing that, Henrietta said. But she began reading differently. She had always read widely. It was essential to the work, and it was also simply who she was. But she turned her attention now toward particular areas: the economics of British financial markets, the social architecture of London's philanthropic circuit, the histories of the major foundations and the families connected to them. She read profiles of the kind of people Victor moved among and absorbed their references, their concerns, their particular vocabulary. She studied Scarlet Vale with the same deliberate attention. Not with hatred. Hatred was exhausting, and she didn't have the energy for it. But with a kind of anthropological curiosity about what this woman was, what she wanted, what she understood about the situation she was in. What became clear, over weeks of observation, was that Scarlet genuinely did not know Victor was married. This wasn't a woman who had looked at Amelia's existence and decided to disregard it. She was operating under the belief that Victor was a divorced man in his mid-40s who was ready to begin again. She had been lied to, and she had built her future on the lie. Amelia found, somewhat to her discomfort, that she could not entirely hate her for it. She did not contact Scarlet. That would come, but not yet. Not until the timing was right. The transformation in her appearance happened gradually, and then, as these things often do, all at once. It started practically. She needed a new dress for a work function. Hargrove Press had an anniversary dinner that she'd agreed to attend, and her existing evening wear felt somehow wrong in a way she couldn't have previously articulated but could now name. It was all chosen to be appropriate, to be inoffensive, to not draw attention. She went to a boutique in South Kensington that her friend from the etiquette course had recommended, and a woman named Celeste spent 90 minutes pulling pieces she wouldn't have considered on her own and being bracingly honest about what worked and what didn't. "You have a very particular quality," Celeste said, holding up a midnight blue wrap dress. "You look like someone who has something on her mind. That's rare. Most of the women who come in here look like they're trying not to have anything on their minds. She shrugged. "It's not interesting. You're interesting. Let's make the outside match." Amelia bought the dress and 3 other things. She got her hair cut, not dramatically, but with intention, shaped properly for the first time in years. She started paying attention to the small things she had always dismissed as vanity. Good shoes, real jewelry, rather than the cheap pieces she'd accumulated without thought. The particular discipline of presentation that she had always associated with women like Scarlet, and therefore decided was not for her. It was, she recognized, not really about appearance at all. It was about deciding, consciously and deliberately, to take up space. The information about the wedding came from Claire Benton on a Thursday morning, delivered in Claire's customary tone of someone reading the weather forecast. Victor had booked a venue. Not publicly, not yet. This was still private, still in the planning stages. But he had placed a deposit on a country estate in Surrey for a date in the following summer. He had also retained a wedding coordinator. The coordinator's firm had drafted a preliminary contract in which Victor was described as a divorced man. Amelia sat with this for a long time. He had booked a wedding venue while she was still his wife. He had described himself as divorced to a wedding planner. He had done all of this while continuing to come home occasionally to the Kensington apartment while she made coffee and tried to finish her translations and didn't know. She called Diana Marsh. "I've seen the documentation," Diana said. "It's useful. The misrepresentation to the coordinator alone won't give us additional grounds, but combined with the asset structuring and the timeline, it builds a picture of someone acting in bad faith. The judge will see it." "I'm not calling about the legal case," Amelia said. A pause. "Then what are you calling about?" "I want to know if there's an event coming up. A public one. Something in his circuit." Diana was quiet for a moment. "The Aldermore Foundation hosts a winter gala every December. It's the most significant social event of the season for the people in his world. His firm sponsors it. He's been on the host committee for 3 years." "When is it?" "Second week of December, 3 weeks from now." Amelia wrote down the date. "May I ask," Diana said carefully, "what you're planning?" "I'm planning to attend," Amelia said, "as his wife." There was another pause. "You have the right to do that." "I know," Amelia said. "That's why I'm going to." She found the dress on a Tuesday in a small designer atelier off Marylebone High Street, a place she would never have gone into a year ago. The kind of shop that doesn't display prices because the assumption is that if you need to ask, you shouldn't be there. The designer was a woman named Rosa Park, who worked out of a studio in the back, and who came out to meet Amelia because someone at Henrietta Voss's etiquette firm had called ahead. Rosa studied her for a moment with the narrowed professional eye of someone who sees clothes the way an architect sees a building site. What's the occasion? A winter gala, the Aldermore Foundation, second week of December. And what do you want to accomplish? Amelia thought about how to answer that honestly. I want to be impossible to ignore. Rosa nodded slowly. Not to impress. No, not to impress. Good. Impressiveness is weak. It asks for judgment. What you want is authority. Rosa turned and walked back toward the studio. Come with me. I have something that was made for a woman who canceled her order. It will need alteration, but I think it was always meant for you. The dress was black, not the safe, polished black of cocktail attire, a deeper black, architectural, with a structure to the bodice that was almost sculptural and a skirt that moved with a kind of quiet authority. When Amelia put it on, she stood in front of the mirror in Rosa's studio and felt something she had not felt in a very long time. Not beautiful exactly, something less comfortable than that. Visible. Rosa stood behind her and looked at her reflection with her arms crossed. Yes, she said simply. That's it. Tap. 3 weeks was enough time to do what needed to be done, but it didn't leave room for hesitation. Diana Marsh filed the paperwork that would need to be filed. Claire Benton consolidated the documentation. Priya reviewed everything with the patient thoroughness of a woman who understood that the details were where the story either held or fell apart. Amelia finished her translation of the French novel. She no longer recognized anything, and yet everything felt familiar, and sent it to her editor, who called to say it was the best work she'd done in years. She attended 2 dinners in that period through Henrietta Voss's connections and moved through them with an ease that still surprised her. She was not performing. She was present. She talked to people and found, as she had always secretly suspected, that most of them were simply looking for someone who would listen with genuine interest. She was very good at listening with genuine interest. She always had been. She had just never been given credit for it. She thought about Victor's messages to Jonathan. She spent the whole dinner talking to the caterer. She had done that, yes. She remembered the evening, a company function 2 years ago, a venue in the city, a caterer who had turned out to be a former academic working 3 jobs to support 2 children, and whom Amelia had found infinitely more compelling than anyone else in the room. She didn't regret the conversation. She regretted that she had accepted Victor's interpretation of it as evidence of her inadequacy. She was done accepting his interpretations of anything. On the night before the gala, she sat at her desk for a long time after dark, not working, just sitting with the city sounds coming in through the window. She was not calm, exactly. She was something more like steady. The way you get steady when you have decided to do something, and the decision is final, and there is nothing left to negotiate with yourself about. She was afraid. That was worth being honest about. The plan was not complicated, but it required her to walk into a room full of people who did not know her and stand her ground in front of a man who had spent years convincing her she had no ground to stand on. She was afraid of being wrong about her own strength. She was afraid of Victor's face when he saw her, and of the specific performance of calm it would require to not look away from it. But she had been afraid of smaller things for 8 years, and let that fear decide things for her. She was done with that particular habit. She closed her notebook, turned off the lamp, and went to bed. In the morning, she had a gala to attend. The Aldermore Foundation Winter Gala was held at Kensington Palace's Orangery, or rather, at the private event space adjacent to it, a building that had been extended and renovated 3 years prior through a donation that had Victor Calloway's firm's name on the plaque by the entrance. Amelia had walked past that plaque before, years ago, at a different event, and felt a small, automated pride at seeing the name. She thought about that now, sitting in the back of the car Priya had insisted on booking, watching the lights of the city move past the window. Priya was beside her, dressed in a deep burgundy that suited her, and wearing the expression of someone who had agreed to do something that frightened her slightly, but was committed to seeing it through. "How are you feeling?" Priya asked. "Like myself," Amelia said. Which is strange, because I haven't felt like myself in quite a long time. Priya looked at her. That dress is extraordinary. Rosa Park. I'm getting her number. Amelia almost smiled. Almost. She was holding herself in a kind of careful stillness, the way you carry something fragile. Not rigid, just intentional. The gown moved around her as the car turned, and she was aware of it the way you are aware of something that fits exactly right, which is to say she was barely aware of it at all. She had a small evening bag. Inside it, her phone, her lipstick, a folded piece of paper with a single typed name and address on it, and a USB drive. The USB drive was Claire Benton's work, mostly. Financial summaries, account documentation, a timeline of asset movements rendered into language that a layperson could read and understand. She was not planning to distribute it at the gala, but she wanted it with her. It felt like the right kind of weight to carry into a room. You know you don't have to say anything tonight, Priya said. You can just go, just be there. Let him see you and say nothing at all. I know. But you're not going to do that. No, Amelia said. I'm not. Priya nodded and looked back out the window. Then I'll be right next to you. You don't have to be. I know that too. The car pulled up to the entrance. There were people on the steps, men in black tie, women in evening gowns, a photographer from some society publication standing off to the right. Amelia watched a couple ascend the steps and disappear through the doors, and she felt her pulse climb in a way she acknowledged and then set aside. She got out of the car. The night air was cold and sharp against her bare arms. She didn't hurry toward the warmth of the entrance. She walked up the steps at the pace of someone who had somewhere to be and was not concerned about getting there. The photographer raised his camera. She let him. The room inside was everything these rooms always are, and nothing she hadn't been inside before, though she had never entered one quite like this, which is to say, alone in any meaningful sense, without Victor's arm to default to, without his running social commentary whispered in her ear about who was who and what they wanted, and why none of them were worth talking to. She had always found his commentary reassuring at the time. She understood now that its purpose had been to make her dependent on his translations of a world he simultaneously excluded her from. She took a glass of champagne from a passing tray and moved into the room. Priya fell into conversation almost immediately with someone she recognized from a conference, and Amelia let her go without concern. She had not come here with a plan that required company. She moved through this room slowly, not because she was hesitant, but because she was paying attention to the architecture of the space, to the groupings of people, to where the photographers were positioned and where the main entrance sat in relation to the rest of the room. She recognized some faces, not all, but enough. There was Jeffrey Hale, the chairman of Victor's firm, talking to a woman Amelia had met once at a function 2 years prior. There was the Ashford Foundation's director, a silver-haired woman named Patricia Thorne, who had been on the charity circuit for 30 years, and who noticed Amelia before Amelia noticed her. Patricia came toward her with the direct purposefulness of someone who has spent a long time at these events and has no patience for the elaborate choreography of being approached. "Amelia Hart," she said. "I wasn't expecting to see you tonight." "I wasn't sure I'd come," Amelia said. Patricia looked at her with an expression that was part assessment and part something warmer. "You look different." "I've had a productive few months." "I heard," Patricia said, with a flatness that suggested she had heard rather more than she was acknowledging. "Victor is coming tonight." "I know." "With Scarlet Veil." "I know that too." Patricia was quiet for a moment. She was not a woman who flustered easily. She had spent too many years navigating too many difficult rooms for that. But there was something in her expression that Amelia read as a kind of careful respect. "Are you all right?" Patricia asked. "I'm better than I've been in years," Amelia said, and meant it. "Could I ask you something, as the director tonight?" "Go ahead." "Oh." "If a situation arose, if someone's presence here tonight created a problem, whose responsibility would it be to manage that?" Patricia looked at her for a long moment. "Mine," she said. "It would be mine. And I would manage it the way I manage most problems at these events, which is to allow them to play out as they need to, provided no one is physically at risk." "No one will be physically at risk." "Then I would let it play out." Patricia took a small sip of her champagne. "I've known Victor Calloway for 11 years, Amelia. I've had my opinions about certain things for rather longer than you might think." Amelia held her gaze. Thank you, Patricia. Patricia turned back toward the room. Get yourself some canapes, she said, with a dry practicality that was somehow exactly right. They're very good this year. Impressive. Victor arrived at 20 minutes past 8. Amelia was standing near the far end of the room, in conversation with a couple she'd just met, a novelist named Gerald and his wife, a structural engineer named B, both of them refreshingly uninterested in impressing anyone and deeply interested in arguing about the restoration of a Victorian railway bridge. She was genuinely engaged in the conversation when she registered the shift in the room, a subtle ripple of attention, heads turning, the particular change in ambient noise that happens when someone significant enters. She turned her head. Victor was at the entrance, coat just handed to the cloakroom attendant, looking precisely as he always looked at these events. Effortlessly composed, slightly flushed with the cold air from outside, handsome in the specific way of men who have been told so often they are handsome that they've simply absorbed it as a feature of the landscape. He was in black tie. The Brioni suit, she noted, the one he'd bought in Milan 2 years ago. He was saying something to the person beside him, laughing, and scarlet veil was on his arm. Amelia had seen her in photographs but not in person, and the first thing she felt, seeing her in the flesh, was a complicated thing she hadn't entirely prepared for. Scarlett was visibly uncertain. It was in the way she held herself, not the manufactured ease of her social media content, but something slightly more rigid, slightly more watchful. She was wearing a green gown, a different one from the Ashford Foundation event, but in the same deep jewel tone, and she was beautiful in the way she was always beautiful, but there was something about the set of her jaw that looked like someone working hard to look like they weren't working hard. Amelia watched Victor scan the room the way he always did at these events, cataloging who was there, who mattered, who needed to be greeted first. She watched his gaze move across the far end of the room. She watched it continue past her. She watched it stop. She watched it come back. The sequence of emotions that crossed Victor Calloway's face in the next 4 seconds was the most honest she had ever seen him. Shock first, genuine, unguarded shock, the kind that strips a man's face entirely clean. Then something that might have been recognition in a broader sense. Not just that's Amelia, but that is not the Amelia I left in Kensington. Then a rapid recalibration, the practiced composure, assembling itself over whatever was happening underneath. He said something to Scarlett. Amelia couldn't hear it from across the room. Scarlett followed his gaze, found Amelia, and her expression was simply confused. The confusion of someone who doesn't yet know what she's looking at. Amelia turned back to Gerald and B. I'm sorry. You were saying about the original ironwork? Gerald blinked, slightly surprised by her composure. Yes, they found 3 original load-bearing elements that had been… Excuse me, a voice at her shoulder. She turned. It was one of Victor's junior colleagues. She couldn't remember his name. A young man she'd met at a firm dinner once and who had the look of someone sent to do something he'd rather not do. Mrs. Calloway, he said, and she noted that he used the name carefully, with a slight emphasis, as if he was unsure whether it was the right one. Mr. Calloway wondered if he might have a word. Of course, she said pleasantly. Please tell him I'll find him later in the evening. I'm in the middle of a conversation. The young man stood for a moment in the particular paralysis of someone not given instructions for this outcome, then retreated. Gerald looked at Amelia. Should we be concerned? Absolutely not, Amelia said. Tell me more about the ironwork. Victor found her himself 20 minutes later. She had known he would. He was not a man who waited well when he felt a situation was slipping out of his control. He appeared at her elbow while she was at the bar, ordering a glass of still water. She had barely touched the champagne, and she wanted a clear head for the rest of the evening. She heard him before she turned, recognized the particular rhythm of his breathing that she knew after 8 years the way you know the sounds of a place you've lived a long time. Amelia. His voice was very quiet, very controlled. She turned to face him. Victor. He looked at her with an intensity she hadn't seen from him in years. Not affection, but attention, the full weight of it, the kind he usually distributed across whichever room he was in, rather than focusing it on any individual. What are you doing here? Attending the Aldermore Gala, she said. Your firm sponsors it, as you know, and as your wife, I have every right to be here. Something tightened in his jaw. We need to talk. We can talk, she agreed. I'm not in any hurry. Amelia. He paused, and she watched him recalibrate. The charming version was assembling itself. She could see the machinery of it. His voice softened. You look... He stopped again. You can say it, she said. I won't be offended. You look extraordinary, he said, and the uncomfortable thing was that it sounded almost genuine. Not a compliment deployed for social effect, but something more like surprise escaping before he could suppress it. Thank you, she said. Is Scarlett well? I noticed her come in. The name landed in the space between them like something dropped. Victor's expression shifted. This isn't the place. You're right. It's probably not the ideal venue for the conversation we need to have. But you've rather removed all the other options, haven't you? You didn't inform me when you began divorce proceedings. You didn't consult me when you started meeting with solicitors. You've had a wedding coordinator on retainer for 3 months who believes you're a divorced man. She said all of this at a perfectly reasonable conversational volume, low enough that it didn't carry more than a foot or two, but with a clarity that left no room for misunderstanding. So when exactly did you plan to tell me? Victor was very still. The composure was still there, but she could see what it was costing him. You've been investigating. I've been protecting myself, she said. There's a difference, though I understand why you'd find them difficult to distinguish. You should have come to me. I'm coming to you now. I mean before, privately. We could have... No, she said, and her voice didn't rise, but something in it changed. We couldn't have, because the conversation you mean, the quiet, private conversation where I accept what you've decided and make it easy for you. I'm not interested in having that conversation, Victor. I haven't been interested in it for a while now. He looked at her for a long moment. There were people around them, not close enough to hear, but close enough to notice the intensity of the exchange, and she could see him calculating the risk of continuing here against the risk of leaving her without a clear answer about what she planned to do. What is it you want? He said finally. Tonight? I just want to have a lovely evening. She looked at him steadily. But we should arrange to meet with our respective solicitors early next week. Diana Marsh represents me. I assume Jonathan Kress is still handling yours? The mention of Jonathan's name did what she'd intended it to do. Victor's eyes changed. She watched the calculation behind them accelerate and then, briefly, fail to produce a result. How do you know about Jonathan? He said carefully. I know a great deal, she said. I've had time. He was quiet for a moment. Then, you're not going to make a scene. It wasn't quite a question, more like a thing he was trying to convince himself of. I haven't decided yet what I'm going to do, she said. But I'll tell you this. You spent 8 years deciding things without consulting me. I've earned the right to take my time. She picked up her water glass. Go back to Scarlett. She looks uncomfortable. Victor opened his mouth and then closed it. He turned and walked back across the room. Amelia watched him go. Her hands were completely steady. She was mildly surprised by this. Scarlet Vale found her an hour later, which was not part of any plan Amelia had formed, but which, on reflection, she should have anticipated. Scarlet was sharper than her public persona suggested, and once Victor had crossed the room to talk to a woman who looked at him with that particular kind of knowing calm, Scarlet would have started asking questions. She appeared beside Amelia near the window, where Amelia had drifted to look out at the lit gardens below. She was close enough that Amelia turned before she spoke. You're Amelia, Scarlet said. It was not a question. Her voice was lower than it sounded in her video content, and less polished. The performance stripped back to something more direct. Her eyes were very clear, that shade of green hazel that photographs well, and they were doing something complicated at the moment. Searching, deciding, preparing for something she wasn't sure of. I am, Amelia said. Scarlet looked at her for a moment. He said you were... She stopped. What did he say I was? It doesn't matter what he said. It does, actually, Amelia said, but we don't have to go through it right now. Scarlet looked out the window. She had the expression of someone doing arithmetic in their head and not liking where the numbers were landing. How long have you been married? 8 years. Scarlet went very still. We've been separated for... Amelia considered the honest version of this. Victor has been planning to separate from me for approximately 18 months, as far as I can determine. But we have not legally separated, there has been no formal filing, and as of this moment we are still married. I became aware of the situation approximately 3 months ago. Scarlett turned to look at her fully. He told me the divorce was finalized. He showed me... She stopped again. What did he show you? A document. Her voice had gone flat. He said it was the final paperwork. Amelia felt a chill that had nothing to do with the window. He fabricated divorce documentation? I don't... Scarlett pressed her fingers to her mouth for a moment, a gesture that had nothing performative about it. I don't know what he did. I just know what he showed me. There was a silence between them that was full of things neither of them had the immediate vocabulary to address. Amelia looked at Scarlett and saw a woman who had also been lied to, systematically, with full intent, by the same person who had spent 8 years lying to her. The situations were not equivalent. Scarlett had not spent years in a diminished marriage, while Amelia had not been deceived into thinking she was in a real one. But there was a specific kind of damage they shared, which was the damage of having trusted someone who had looked them in the face and chosen to be dishonest. I'm not your enemy, Amelia said. I want you to know that. Scarlett looked at her with an expression that was hard to read. You should be. Maybe, but I'm not. She paused. What I am is someone who has spent 3 months finding out the truth about a man who gave both of us a great deal less than we deserved. I thought you should hear some of that truth from me rather than from other sources. What other sources? Amelia looked across the room. Victor had found Jeffrey Hale and was deep in conversation, his back to them, doing what he did best in rooms like this, projecting assurance, filling space, making the people around him feel that he was the fixed point from which everything else could be measured. By the end of tonight, Amelia said quietly, there will be other sources. Scarlett followed her gaze. She watched Victor for a long moment, and Amelia watched Scarlett watch him, and there was something in Scarlett's face that moved through stages. Disbelief giving way to grief, giving way to something harder and quieter than either. I thought he loved me, Scarlett said. Her voice was matter-of-fact, which was worse somehow than if it had broken. I thought that too, Amelia said, for a long time. At 10 o'clock, the Foundation's director, Patricia Thorne, took the small stage at the end of the room to give the traditional year-end address. Amelia had found Priya again by then, and they stood together near the side of the room, close enough to hear clearly. Patricia's address was what it always was, gracious, specific about the year's charitable achievements, warm without being saccharine. She mentioned the Foundation's major donors and the firm that anchored the event. She mentioned Victor Calloway by name and thanked him for his continued support, and Amelia watched Victor accept the acknowledgement with the practiced modesty of a man who understood exactly how to receive public recognition. And then Patricia departed the stage and the room reopened into conversation, and Amelia set down her water glass and said to Priya, "Now." Priya put her hand briefly on Amelia's arm, not restraining, steadying. "You sure?" "Completely." She moved toward the center of the room. She did not rush. There was nothing aggressive in her movement. She wasn't cutting through the crowd. She was simply making her way through it. And people stepped aside not because she demanded it, but because there was something in the way she was moving that suggested purpose. And most people instinctively give way to purpose. She had learned that from Henrietta Voss, among other things. Jeffrey Hale was the first person she reached. He was the chairman of the firm and had been at Victor's side at these events for 15 years. He was a man in his late 60s who had built his reputation on the belief that he understood everything relevant that happened within a certain radius of the financial world he operated in, and he looked at Amelia now with the expression of a man encountering evidence that he may not have understood as much as he thought. "Jeffrey," she said, "I'm glad you're here. I've been wanting to speak with you." "Amelia," he looked at her carefully. "It's been a while." "It has. I'd like to talk to you about the firm's involvement in certain financial structures that Victor has been managing." She said it simply, without drama. "Specifically the holding company in Battersea, which I suspect you're unaware of, and which has some implications for the firm's position." Jeffrey went very still. I'm not making accusations," she said. "I'm offering information. What you do with it is your business. But you should have it, because if you don't have it from me, You'll have it from the press at some point in the next few weeks, and I thought it would be more useful to have it now." Jeffrey looked at her for a long moment. He was not a man who panicked. The whole of his career had been built on the refusal to panic. But she could see the rapid internal calculation happening behind his eyes, the same calculation she had watched Victor do earlier, but with the crucial difference that Jeffrey was a man whose interests and Victor's were not entirely the same. "Come find me tomorrow morning," he said quietly. "I'll make time." "Thank you." She moved on. She found a journalist she recognized, a woman named Claire Hooper, who wrote a financial column for one of the major broadsheets and who had been at the perimeter of Victor's social world for years, always present, always watching, producing the kind of considered long-form pieces about London's financial elite that people read carefully and were privately terrified of appearing in unfavorably. Amelia had met her twice briefly at other events and had never registered on her radar as anyone of particular relevance. She registered now. "Miss Hooper," Amelia said. Claire Hooper turned from the person she'd been talking to and looked at Amelia with the alert attention of a journalist who has just had the strong professional instinct that something is about to happen. "Mrs. Calloway, I didn't know you were here tonight." "I've been here all evening," Amelia said pleasantly. "I've been making a few conversations. I wondered if you might find time for a coffee in the coming week. There's a situation I think would interest you, and I want to make sure it's told accurately." Claire Hooper looked at her steadily. "What kind of situation?" "The kind that involves asset structures, a holding company, a wedding coordinator who was given fraudulent documentation, and a very specific pattern of behavior by someone whose image in this room is rather carefully managed." A very long beat. "I would make time for that coffee," Claire Hooper said. Yes, said. She didn't look for Victor. She didn't have to. Victor found her. He appeared at her side as she was finishing a conversation near the back of the room, and his composure had fractured in small but visible ways, his tie slightly less perfect than it had been, something in his jaw that suggested the evening had not gone the way he'd intended. "You've been talking to Jeffrey," he said. "I've been talking to a lot of people," Amelia said. "What did you say to him?" "The truth, mostly." She looked at him. "I've also spoken to Claire Hooper." The color left his face in a way that would have satisfied her more if she'd been capable of feeling satisfaction about it. What she felt instead was a kind of sad tiredness, which was not what she'd expected and which was, she thought, probably more accurate. "Amelia, stop!" His voice had dropped to something that was trying to be commanding and landing somewhere closer to desperate. "You don't understand what you're doing." "I understand exactly what I'm doing," she said. "I'm protecting myself, which is what I should have done years ago, and which you made very sure I didn't believe I was capable of." "I never said—" "You didn't have to say it," she said. "You said it in other ways. You said it every time you went to an event without me and came home and described it in a way that made clear I would have embarrassed you. You said it every time you told me I didn't understand your world, that I was too ordinary for it. You said it when you wrote to Jonathan Kress that I was stubbornly, fundamentally ordinary and that you'd outgrown me." She watched his expression. "Yes, I know about those messages too." Victor said nothing. He was looking at her with something she had no comfortable name for. Not quite guilt, not quite anger. Something more complicated and more useless than either. "I want you to understand something," she said, and her voice was very steady. "I didn't come here to destroy you. I came here because I was tired of being invisible in my own life. I came here because I am your wife, and I have every right to be in this room, and I wanted just once for you to have to see me the way other people do." She left him standing there. She found Priya near the entrance and said quietly, "I'd like to go." They were in the car 20 minutes later, moving through the lit streets of the city, and for a long time neither of them said anything. Priya looked at her once or twice, trying to read her. "Are you all right?" Priya asked finally. Amelia looked out the window. The city moved past. Lit windows, dark sky, the particular texture of London on a cold December night that she had always loved and that felt tonight like something she was seeing with new eyes. Not better eyes, necessarily. Just more honest ones. "I think I'm going to be," she said. It wasn't a triumphant answer, but it was the true one, and she was done with any other kind. She slept better that night than she had in months, which surprised her. She had expected to lie awake running through the evening. replaying conversations, interrogating her own choices, cataloging what she'd done wrong. Instead, she fell asleep quickly and woke to gray London light coming through the curtains, with the particular sensation of someone who has put something down that they've been carrying for a long time. Not relief, exactly. More like the absence of a weight she'd been so accustomed to that she'd stopped noticing it was there. She made coffee and sat at her desk and opened her laptop. There were 11 unread emails. 3 were from Victor, sent between midnight and 2 in the morning, which she read in sequence with her coffee cooling beside her. The first was controlled, professionally worded, almost formal, requesting that she refrain from further contact with his colleagues or the press, and suggesting they arrange a meeting with their respective legal representatives before the situation escalated. The second, sent 40 minutes later, was less controlled. He had begun to repeat himself, which he never did, and there was an edge to the phrasing that she recognized as the particular kind of anger that comes from a man who has lost the ability to manage how he is being perceived. The third, sent at 2:14 in the morning, was 4 lines. You have no idea what you've set in motion. I hope you're prepared for the consequences. I built that reputation over 20 years. You had no right. She read all 3, then forwarded them to Diana Marsh with a short note, then closed the email. The other 8 messages were not from Victor. 2 were from people she barely knew, acquaintances from the periphery of Victor's social world, people whose names she associated with brief encounters at functions over the years, expressing what appeared to be genuine concern, asking if she was all right, using language that suggested they already knew something had changed. One was from Gerald, the novelist she'd met at the gala, who had apparently tracked down her publisher contact and written to ask if she'd be interested in being part of a literary panel discussion in the spring. And one was from Scarlet Vale. She sat with that one for a moment before opening it. It was short. I've been up all night. I'd like to talk if you're willing. I understand if you're not. S. She looked at it for a while. Then she wrote back, Coffee, tomorrow. I'll send you a time and place. Diana Marsh called at 9. I've reviewed Victor's emails, Diana said, skipping any preamble. The third one is particularly useful. You had no right is the kind of phrasing that will look very interesting to a judge when we present it alongside the documentation we already have. It's the language of someone who genuinely believed he was entitled to proceed without your knowledge or consent. That's because he did believe that, Amelia said, which is precisely the problem for him. Diana paused. I received a call this morning from Jonathan Kress, Victor's solicitor. He's requesting an urgent meeting. I've told him we're available Thursday, which is not urgent, but it's also not unreasonable. I want you to know that the tone of the call was different than I expected. Different how? Less confident, Diana said. Jonathan Kress is not a man who calls opposing counsel the morning after an evening event, unless something happened at that event that changed his client's position. Jeffrey Hale is on the board of Victor's firm. If Jeffrey has questions about the Battersea Holding Company, Victor has a problem that exists independently of the divorce proceedings. Good, Amelia said, and heard how flat it sounded without the satisfaction it might have had a month ago. Is that a problem for me? Not in the way you might worry about. Anything the firm investigates internally will generate documentation that can support our case. It doesn't hurt you, it helps you. Diana paused again, and in the pause Amelia heard the consideration of something. There's one more thing. Claire Hooper called my office this morning. Amelia set down her coffee mug. She's not writing the piece yet, Diana said. She's doing her due diligence first. She asked me to confirm certain factual details about the timeline, which I was able to do within the scope of public record. She told me she plans to contact Victor's firm for comment before publication. How long before she publishes? She said she needed 2 to 3 weeks minimum to do it properly. She's not interested in a rushed piece. No, Amelia said. She wouldn't be. After she hung up, she sat for a moment looking at the unfinished Spanish translation still open on her screen. The manuscript was about a woman who had left a city and returned 20 years later to settle her dead mother's estate, and who kept finding evidence throughout the house of a life her mother had lived that she had never been told about. It was not, the novelist had said in her author's note, an autobiographical book, but it was a truthful one. Amelia found her place and started working. Victor showed up at the apartment that afternoon. She heard the key in the lock. He still had a key, which was something Diana had advised her to address, but which she hadn't gotten around to yet. And she was at her desk when he came in, still in his coat, which he hadn't bothered to take off. His face was not the face he presented to rooms full of people. It was tired in a way she had rarely seen from him, and there was something around his eyes that looked like a man who had also not slept well. "You changed the study," he said, looking around. It was the first thing he said. Not a greeting, not an accusation, an observation, slightly confused, as if he'd been bracing for a particular kind of encounter and the rearranged bookshelves had thrown him off. She had changed the study. 3 weeks ago, she'd moved her desk to face the window instead of the wall, replaced the curtains he'd chosen with something in a warm amber that she actually liked, and reorganized the bookshelves in a way that made sense to her rather than the way he'd once suggested. "I did," she said. He stood in the doorway of the study looking at her with an expression she couldn't cleanly categorize. He looked, more than anything, like someone who had come here with a speech prepared and was now uncertain whether the speech still applied. "I need to understand what you're planning," he said. "My solicitor has already communicated with yours. I'm not talking about the legal process." He came into the room and she turned her chair to face him properly, which seemed to unsettle him slightly. He'd been expecting her to keep her back half-turned, the posture she'd defaulted to for years in difficult conversations with him. "I'm talking about Hooper and Jeffrey. What are you trying to do?" "Protect myself," she said, "as I told you last night. Talking to a journalist is not protecting yourself. Talking to a journalist is Victor." She said his name with a precision that stopped him. "You had a solicitor working on structuring my exit from this marriage for approximately a year before I knew the marriage was ending. You moved assets. You misrepresented yourself to a wedding coordinator. You sent messages to a friend calling me fundamentally ordinary and saying I wouldn't fight because I wasn't the type." She looked at him steadily. "Did you think none of that would have consequences?" He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice was lower, something of the confrontational edge withdrawn. "The messages to Jonathan. Yes." "How?" "It doesn't matter how." He sat down, which she hadn't expected. Not in any aggressive way. He simply sat in the chair near the window, the one she'd always thought of as her reading chair, and put his elbows on his knees and looked at the floor. It was such an uncharacteristically defeated posture that she felt, unwillingly, the echo of every version of him she had ever cared for. "I know I handled this badly," he said. "That's a significant understatement." "I know." He looked up. "I didn't plan it this way. I want you to know that. The way it became what it became, with Scarlett, with the timeline, with not telling you. I didn't plan to be this dishonest. You planned it enough to hire solicitors and move money and fabricate divorce documents." The last part landed. She watched it land. "He told you about the document," Victor said. She did. A silence stretched between them that was longer and more complicated than either of them had words for. Victor looked at the floor again. There was no version of what he'd done that improved on examination, and he was intelligent enough to know that. "What do you want?" he said finally. The same question he had asked last night, but with all the calculation stripped out of it. Just the question. "I want what I'm legally entitled to," she said. "Half of the jointly held assets and a fair assessment of the ones you've been moving, which we will reconstruct with Claire Benton's documentation. I want this handled through Diana Marsh and Jonathan Kress, without further attempts to pressure me through personal appearances or emails at 2 a.m. She paused. "And I want you to think carefully about what you say and do in the next few weeks. Because the only thing that will reduce the damage to your reputation at this point is behaving with more integrity than you have been." He looked at her for a long time. "You're not what I expected," he said. "No," she agreed. "I'm not what you expected. I wasn't even what I expected." She turned back to her desk. "I think you should go, Victor." He went. She cried after he left, which she hadn't expected either. Not the kind of crying she'd done in the bathroom in those first terrible days after discovering the photographs. That had been raw, almost involuntary, the body's way of processing shock. This was different, quieter. She sat in her reading chair, the one he'd just vacated, which still carried the faintest trace of his cologne, the same one he'd worn for 10 years, and she let herself feel the grief that had been waiting patiently underneath everything else. She had loved him. That was the part that was easy to lose in the machinery of investigations and solicitors and strategic conversations. She had loved the man she'd believed him to be, had loved 8 years of a life that was real to her, even when it turned out to be less real than she'd understood. Grief for that didn't make her foolish, and it didn't contradict everything else she'd done. It just made her human, which was something she was slowly getting more comfortable being. She gave herself an hour. Then she washed her face, made tea, and went back to her desk. She met Scarlett the following morning at a small cafe in Fitzrovia that Amelia had chosen carefully. Not too central, not the kind of place where either of them was likely to be recognized by anyone who mattered. It was the sort of cafe that served good coffee and didn't have a social media presence worth mentioning. Scrubbed wooden tables, mismatched chairs, a chalkboard menu, a barista who was clearly doing a PhD and had no interest in the personal lives of customers. Scarlett arrived 4 minutes late, which Amelia suspected was earlier than her usual habit. She was in ordinary clothes, jeans, a camel coat, her hair down and simple. And without the construction of her public image, she looked younger and considerably less certain of herself. She found Amelia's table and sat down without taking off her coat, as if she hadn't yet decided how long she was staying. "Thank you for coming," Amelia said. "Thank you for agreeing to this." Scarlett wrapped her hands around the coffee mug in front of her. "I almost canceled 3 times. I know the feeling." Scarlett looked at her. "How are you not angry with me?" "I am angry," Amelia said. "I'm angry at a lot of things, but being angry at you specifically requires believing you knew what the situation was, and I don't think you did." "I didn't," Scarlett said. "I want to be very clear about that. He told me he was divorced. He showed me—" She stopped, pressed her lips together. The document looked real. It had the right kind of language, the court reference numbers, everything. I'm not someone who just takes a man's word for things. I checked. "He had it made," Amelia said. Scarlett was quiet for a moment. "Claire Benton," she said, "your investigator. I found out who she is. I'm thinking of hiring her myself. She's very good. I want to know everything he told me that wasn't true." Like, she said it with the flat determination of someone who has decided that the truth is going to hurt regardless, and that delay doesn't help. "I've been going back through 2 years and I keep finding things that don't add up anymore when I look at them with what I know now." She looked down at her coffee. "I feel like an idiot." "You're not an idiot," Amelia said. "You trusted someone who was deliberately, systematically dishonest with you. That's not a character failure. It's what happens when you trust the wrong person. You trusted him for 8 years. "I did." "And you don't think that makes you an idiot?" Amelia considered this honestly. "I think it makes me someone who wanted to believe things were better than they were, and stayed too long because admitting the truth meant admitting I'd lost years of my life to it." She looked at Scarlett. "Which is different from being an idiot. Though it doesn't feel different at 3 in the morning." Scarlett almost smiled. It didn't quite make it all the way. "No," she said. "It doesn't." They sat for a moment in the not quite comfortable silence of 2 women who have been placed in a situation neither of them designed and are trying to figure out what the correct emotional register for it actually is. "What happens now?" Scarlett asked. "With the divorce. The legal process moves forward. It will take time. Victor's position is considerably weaker than he planned for it to be." "Because of last night?" "Because of the last 3 months," Amelia said. Last night was me deciding to stop being invisible. The actual work happened before that." Scarlett nodded slowly. She looked out the window at the street where people were moving past in the gray morning cold with the focused purposefulness of London on a weekday. "I'm leaving London," she said. "For a while. I have family in Edinburgh. I need to be somewhere that isn't here, isn't all of this." "That seems sensible." "I know people are going to think—" She stopped. "My audience, the people who follow my content, they've been rooting for us, for Victor and me. There are people in my comments who have been asking about the wedding date for 6 months. She said it with a particular kind of misery that Amelia recognized as the specific pain of a public humiliation that has an audience built in. What are you going to tell them? I don't know yet. She wrapped both hands more tightly around the mug. The honest version is that I was lied to, which is true, but it's a story where I'm the woman who didn't know her boyfriend was married, and that's going to be how people see it regardless of the context. Some people, Amelia said, not all of them. Scarlett looked at her. You could help me, if you wanted to. You could tell people what actually happened, that I didn't know. Amelia looked at her steadily. If anyone asks me directly, I will tell them exactly what I told you, that I don't believe you knew. She paused. What I'm not going to do is manage your public image. That's yours to manage. Scarlett held her gaze for a moment. That's fair, she said. You should talk to Claire Hooper, Amelia said. Not as a subject. She's working on a piece about Victor's financial behavior, not about you. But she's honest and she's careful, and if your experience is part of a larger pattern of how he operates, she'll want to represent it accurately. Would that help you? It might help both of us, Amelia said, and it would almost certainly be the truth. They sat for another 20 minutes, talking about things that were not Victor. Scarlett's family in Edinburgh, the novel Amelia was translating, the specific difficulty of rebuilding a life that has been organized around a person who turned out to be different than you understood. It was not a warm conversation exactly. There was too much complicated history in the room for warmth, but it was honest, which was more than either of them had had recently. And when they left the cafe and went their separate ways on the cold Fitzrovia street, Amelia felt, if not lightness, then at least something like clarity. Mouse. The weeks that followed had a different quality from the ones before the gala. The before-gala weeks had been clandestine, inward, structured around the gathering of information and the careful construction of a position. The after-gala weeks were more exposed. The work was still happening. Diana Marsh and Jonathan Kress met on Thursday as scheduled, and the meeting apparently went well from Diana's perspective and poorly from Jonathan's, which was the intended outcome. But it was happening in a world that now knew, in a general way, that something was shifting. Victor's firm opened an internal review of the Battersea Holding Company within 48 hours of the gala. Amelia learned this from Diana, who had heard it from a colleague. The review was, officially, a routine compliance matter. Unofficially, it was Geoffrey Hale establishing what he knew and didn't know before the story found its way into print, which everyone involved understood was a question of when, not if. Victor called twice more in the week after the gala. She let both calls go to voicemail. The messages were different from the emails, quieter, less defensive, more tired. The first one was essentially a reiteration of his solicitor's position, just in his voice. The second, which came on a Wednesday evening, was shorter. I've been thinking about what you said, about the messages to Jonathan. I want you to know I don't think I realized how that would sound to you. That's not an excuse. I just want you to know I've been thinking about it. She listened to it twice and then set the phone down and went back to her manuscript. She finished the Spanish translation on a Thursday, 3 days ahead of deadline. Her editor, a woman named Susanna, who had been with Hargrove Press for 20 years and who communicated primarily in terse, useful emails, wrote back within 2 hours. This is your best yet. The prose in the middle section especially. I want to talk about the next project. I have something in mind I think you'd be right for. Amelia read the email 3 times. It was a small thing. It was not a small thing. She went for a walk along the river that afternoon because the weather had turned briefly, improbably clear for December, and she wanted to be outside in it. She walked from Embankment toward Waterloo Bridge, moving against the tide of people who were finishing their working days, and she let herself think without any particular agenda. The Thames beside her was the color of pewter, and the bridges were lit, and the city did what it always did at this hour, which was to become simultaneously more beautiful and more indifferent, the way large cities always are when the light changes. She thought about the French novel she'd translated before all of this started. She no longer recognized anything, and yet everything felt familiar. She thought she understood it differently now. The woman in that book had returned to a place that looked the same and was not. Amelia was living in a city that looked the same and was not, or rather, she herself was not, and the city was simply the same city it had always been. And the difference was that she was no longer trying to make herself invisible inside it. She stopped on the bridge and looked at the water for a while. A tour boat went past below, lit up and carrying a small crowd of people looking outward at the city. She watched it until it was out of sight. She thought about what Victor had said in her study. "You're not what I expected." She had agreed with him, and she had meant it. But she was also, she thought now, exactly what she had always been, just without the long habit of minimizing it. She started walking again. Claire Hooper's coffee meeting happened on a Friday morning, 2 weeks after the gala, at a place in Soho that Claire Hooper apparently used for all her source meetings. A deliberately anonymous Italian cafe where the owner clearly recognized her and equally clearly had no interest in who she met or what they discussed. It was a good spot for the purpose. Claire Hooper was in her mid-40s, compact and precise, with the kind of stillness that comes from years of listening carefully to people who are telling her things they may later regret. She had a notebook and a pen, but kept them both on the table between them rather than in her hands, which Amelia suspected was an intentional signal. "I'm listening, not recording." "I want to be clear about what I'm writing," Claire said at the start. "This is a financial piece. Victor Calloway's behavior in the context of the holding company, the asset movement, the misrepresentation to his firm. The personal dimensions of the situation are context, not the story itself." "I understand." "That means I'm not going to write about your marriage in detail. I'm going to write about a pattern of behavior by a man in a position of financial trust, and the personal situation is evidence of that pattern. The fabricated document to his girlfriend, the misrepresentation of his marital status, the attempt to structure your exit from the marriage in a way that minimized your access to information and assets." She looked at Amelia across the table. "Is that a problem for you?" "No," Amelia said. "That's exactly the story." "Good." And Claire made a small note. "I've also spoken to Scarlett Vale. She was useful, and I thought she was honest." "She was honest with me, too." "It's a strange situation," Claire said, with the flatness of someone who has covered strange situations for 20 years and no longer finds them surprising. "Two women who have legitimate grievances against the same man, with no grievance against each other. It happens more often than you'd think." "Does it resolve itself neatly?" "Almost never," Claire said. "But it doesn't have to." She looked at Amelia. "I want to ask you something that I'm not going to put in the piece, but that I'm curious about. Did you come to that gala with the intention of it going the way it went? Or did it develop?" Amelia thought about how to answer that honestly. "I came to the gala with the intention of being seen," she said, "by Victor specifically, but also by the room. I wanted the people who knew him to know I existed, and to see what I actually was rather than the version of me he'd been presenting. Everything that happened after that was, I made choices as the evening went on. Some of them I planned, some I didn't. The conversation with Jeffrey Hale, that I planned. The conversation with Scarlett Vale, that I didn't." Claire nodded slowly. "And you don't regret it, any of it?" "I regret that it was necessary," Amelia said. "I don't regret doing it." Claire Hooper looked at her with the expression of someone who finds the distinction meaningful. She picked up her pen and made a longer note. The piece published on a Thursday morning, 18 days after the gala. Amelia read it at her desk with her coffee, slowly. Claire Hooper had done what she said she'd do. The story was financial, specific, careful, built on documentation rather than assertion. Victor was named. The holding company was named. The timeline of asset movement was laid out with the clean logic of a balance sheet. The personal elements were present but subordinate. A married man who had misrepresented his status, who had fabricated legal documentation, who had structured his affairs in ways designed to disadvantage his wife. There was a quote from Jeffrey Hale's office confirming the internal review was ongoing. There was a quote from Diana Marsh confirming the legal proceedings. There was a quote from Scarlett Vale that read, "I was deceived about the fundamental facts of the situation. I have no further comment." There was no quote from Victor. There was a quote from Amelia near the end of the piece. She had given it carefully, revised it 3 times with Priya before sending it to Claire. It read, I spent 8 years in a marriage that I now understand was built on a significant imbalance of information and power. Addressing that imbalance has been the work of the last several months. I'm grateful to everyone who helped me do it." She read the piece through once more, then closed her laptop. Her phone had already started receiving messages from Priya, from Henrietta Voss, from her editor Susanna, from Gerald the novelist, from numbers she didn't recognize that she set aside to deal with later. She read Priya's first. "It's very good. She did it properly. How are you?" She wrote back, "I'm fine, genuinely. Come for dinner this weekend?" Then she opened her translation and got back to work. The morning continued outside her window. Gray December London, buses and pigeons, and people going about the ordinary business of their lives. She translated 3 pages before lunch. The prose was difficult in places, resistant to easy equivalence between languages, and she was glad for the difficulty. It asked something of her, and she had learned recently that she liked being asked. At 12:30, Victor's name appeared on her phone. She looked at it for a moment. She let it ring. When the voicemail notification came, she didn't listen to it immediately. She made herself lunch first, properly, at the table, with a book open beside her plate, and then she put on her coat and went outside into the cold December air, walking nowhere in particular, just moving through a city that was hers as much as it was anyone's. She thought about the piece, about what it meant that it was now in the world and could not be unput there. She thought about Victor reading it and what that would feel like for him, and found she was able to sit with both the justice of it and the residual sadness of it simultaneously, without either canceling the other out. That, she thought, was probably what it meant to be getting better. Not the absence of complicated feelings, but the ability to hold them without being dismantled. She walked for an hour. Then she went home and listened to Victor's voicemail. His voice was quiet. "I read the piece," he said. "I'm not going to pretend it wasn't what I expected, because I think I knew it was coming. A pause. "I wanted you to know that I'm not going to contest the legal process anymore. I've spoken to Jonathan. We'll proceed the way Diana wants. That's all. That's all I wanted to say." She saved the message to send to Diana. Then she stood in her hallway for a moment in her coat, looking at the apartment she had slowly been making her own over the last few weeks, and felt something move through her that she didn't immediately have a name for. Not happiness, not yet. It was too soon and too complicated for that. But something adjacent to relief. The particular relief of a long thing finally beginning to end. She hung up her coat. She went back to her desk. Outside the window, the December light was already fading, the city shifting from its afternoon gray to the lit-up dark of winter evening, and she turned on her desk lamp and found her place in the manuscript and kept going. Victor's decision not to contest the process did not mean the process was simple. Nothing about dismantling 8 years of shared legal and financial life is simple, and Amelia had been in this long enough to know that a man saying he won't fight is not the same as a man who makes things easy. Victor had made his declaration in a voicemail at the end of a bad week, when Claire Hooper's piece was freshly in the world and his options looked limited. By the following Monday, when Jonathan Kress and Diana Marsh sat down together in a conference room in Mayfair, the shape of what not contesting actually meant had already begun to narrow and qualify itself in the ways that legal processes always do when money is involved. Diana called Amelia after the meeting with the particular tone she used when she had something complicated to explain. "He's not contesting the divorce itself," Diana said. "He's contesting the asset valuation. Specifically, he's arguing that certain instruments moved through the holding company were investment vehicles rather than marital assets, which is a position that will require us to demonstrate the opposite." Can we demonstrate the opposite? Claire Benton already has. The question is whether the documentation holds up to the specific legal challenge they're preparing, which it will, but it will take time to establish properly in front of a judge. A pause. "This is normal, Amelia. This is what the process looks like. It doesn't mean he's going back on what he said. It means he has a solicitor whose job is to protect as much of his financial position as possible, and Jonathan Kress is doing that job." How long? Realistically, several months before a settlement hearing, possibly longer if he pushes on specific items. But the internal review at his firm has complicated things for him considerably. Jeffrey Hale's office is cooperating with our financial documentation requests, that's not something that happens often. It suggests Jeffrey has decided that distancing the firm from Victor's personal conduct is the priority. Amelia thought about Jeffrey Hale's face at the gala. The rapid calculation she'd watched happen behind his eyes. "So he's cutting Victor loose," she said. "Carefully," Diana said. "The way people in those positions always do things carefully. But yes, effectively." After she hung up, Amelia sat for a while with the weight of it. She had known this was coming, had understood since the beginning that the road from the gala to a signed settlement was long and full of the specific tedium of legal procedure. But knowing a thing and living through its daily texture are different experiences, and there were moments, particularly in the gray middle stretch of January, when the whole business felt less like justice in motion and more like a machine that kept asking her for more. She kept working. It was the thing that held the shape of her days when everything else was uncertain. The manuscripts, the deadlines, the particular and absorbing difficulty of finding the English equivalent of a thought that was formed in another language. Susanna at Hargrove had sent her a new project, a contemporary Italian novel, a family saga spanning 3 generations, ambitious and structurally demanding, and Amelia had accepted it without the anxiety she would have felt a year ago. She knew she could do it. She had always known she could do it, somewhere underneath the long habit of not quite believing herself. The January that followed the gala was a month of aftermath, which is a different kind of difficult than crisis. Crisis has urgency, it moves quickly, and gives you something to push against. Aftermath is slower and quieter and asks more of you, because there's no immediate emergency to organize yourself around. There is just the ordinary continuation of life, which contains the grief and the anger and the occasional small victories all at once, with no particular order to them. She had dinner with Priya twice in January, and once with Gerald and his wife Bea, who had somehow become people she saw with actual regularity, which had not been her intention but which she found she didn't mind. Gerald was writing a new novel and wanted to talk about the mechanics of narrative structure across languages, which Amelia found genuinely interesting, and Bea had strong opinions about everything and expressed them without apology, which Amelia found bracing in the way that honest company always is. "You seem different than when we met," Bea said at their second dinner, with the bluntness that was apparently simply how she communicated. "At the gala. You seemed like someone bracing for something. Now you seem like someone who's past the bracing." "I'm in the middle of something fairly complex," Amelia said. "I know. Gerald told me." Bea looked at her without apology for having been told. "I'm not asking about the legal situation. I'm saying you seem more like yourself." "I'm not sure I know what I seem like," Amelia said. "That's not true," Bea said. "You know exactly. You just don't trust it yet." It was the kind of observation that landed differently than she expected, because it was accurate in a way she hadn't articulated to herself. She did know what she seemed like. She was simply still in the process of believing that what she seemed like was what she actually was, rather than a performance she'd have to maintain. The distinction, she was slowly learning, was not as large as she'd thought. Victor came to the apartment once more, in late January. This time he called ahead, which was different, and she said he could come because Diana had suggested a direct conversation about one specific item in the asset dispute might move things forward faster than letters between solicitors. He looked worse than he had in December. Not dramatically worse. He was still Victor, still dressed well, still carrying himself with the posture of a man accustomed to taking up space. But there were things around the edges that she noticed in the way you notice things about people you have known very closely. A thinness in his face that hadn't been there. A slight roughness to the skin beneath his eyes. He had not been sleeping well either. This was not satisfying to observe. It was just true. He sat at the kitchen table, which was where they'd had all their serious conversations over the years, and she made tea because it gave her something to do with her hands during the part where they were settling into the conversation. "The Battersea property," he said, getting to it directly. "Jonathan says you're claiming it as a marital asset. Claire Benton has documented that the rental income from the Battersea storage facility has been structured through the holding company in a way that complicates the investment vehicle argument," Amelia said. "Diana's position is that it qualifies as a marital asset under the framework of how the holding company was used." That's a stretch. Diana doesn't think so. Neither does the financial forensics consultant she brought in. She set his tea down across the table and sat with hers. "Victor, you know what this is. You structured it to look like an investment vehicle so it would be harder to claim. Claire found the structure. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the table. I'm not trying to take things that aren't mine, she said. I'm trying to take what is mine. There's a difference. I know there's a difference. He looked up. I know. He turned the mug between his hands. The firm's review is going to conclude in February. They're restructuring my role. I'm not being dismissed, but the host committee position is being quietly retired. Some client relationships are being transferred. She had heard parts of this from Diana, but not the details. She listened. I built that for 20 years, he said. The client relationships, the position in the room. I knew every person at that gala, and I'd worked for most of those connections for the better part of my career. He said it without self-pity, which made it easier to hear. Just fact. I understand it's a consequence. I'm not telling you this to make you feel guilty. I know. I'm telling you because I want you to know that I understand what I did, not just to you, though that's the larger part of it, but I understand what I did to the whole thing, to my own work. I made choices that were... He stopped, tried again. I told myself a story about you that justified things I wanted to do, about you being ordinary and not belonging in my world. And the truth is that was never about you. She looked at him carefully. It was about me being afraid, he said. I've been talking to someone, a therapist, since January. He looked slightly uncomfortable saying it, which she found both human and somewhat overdue. She's been very clear with me about the distinction between the story I was telling and what was actually happening. What was actually happening? I was building something that felt impressive from the outside and was very uncomfortable from the inside. And instead of dealing with that discomfort, I made it your problem. I told myself you were the limitation. He looked at her with the difficult honesty of someone doing work on themselves and not finding it easy. You were never the limitation, Amelia. You were the only thing in my life that was actually real, and I spent years treating that as a liability. The kitchen was quiet. The building made its ordinary building sounds, pipes, distant traffic, someone moving overhead in the upstairs apartment. She didn't know what to do with what he'd said, and she sat with that uncertainty for a moment rather than immediately reaching for a response. Part of her had wanted, at some point in the last several months, to hear exactly this. The acknowledgement, the accountability, the specific admission of what he'd done and why. She had it now, and what she found was that it changed less than she'd expected. Not because it wasn't meaningful, it was, but because her sense of herself had stopped being contingent on his understanding of her. She had reclaimed that ground while he was still trying to hold it. I'm glad you're talking to someone, she said finally, and meant it. I'm not asking for another chance, he said. I know that ship has sailed, and I know it's my fault it did. I'm not here for that. I know. I just wanted you to know that He paused. I see it now. What I was looking at and not seeing for years. I see it now. That matters, she said. It doesn't change what happened, but it matters. He nodded. He drank his tea. They agreed, somewhat anticlimactically, on the terms of the Battersea discussion, which Diana would formalize with Jonathan by the end of the week. He put on his coat and she walked him to the door. At the threshold he paused. The Spanish novel you're translating, he said. Susanna mentioned it when I ran into her at something in January. She was enthusiastic. Susanna is enthusiastic about very few things. I know, that's why I noticed. He looked at her for a moment. I'm glad you're working well. So am I, she said. After he left, she stood in the hallway for a moment. Then she went to her desk and emailed Diana about the Battersea terms and got back to the Italian manuscript, which was waiting for her at the beginning of a particularly demanding chapter about a grandmother who has spent 40 years keeping a secret from her family, and who has to decide at the end of her life whether the truth is more important than the peace she's constructed around the lie. It was a good chapter. She translated it carefully. February came, and with it the particular quality of London in the last days of winter, the days slightly longer than they'd been, the cold still present but without December's conviction, the city beginning its slow accumulation of energy toward spring. She noticed these things more than she had in previous years. She had been less attentive to the texture of the city while her attention had been directed inward, toward the management of a marriage that was slowly failing, and now she was paying attention again. She walked more. Not with any particular destination, just the Kensington streets, the park in the morning when the light was cold and clean, the market on Portobello Road on Saturday mornings where she bought vegetables and talked to the cheese vendor who had very strong opinions about the EU and who she found unexpectedly entertaining. These were small things. They were also the things that make a life feel like a life rather than just a series of days going by. Priya noticed. "You're lighter," Priya said, over dinner in early February. "You look physically lighter. Is that the walk thing?" "Probably partly. And the work." "Definitely the work." Amelia poured more wine into Priya's glass. "Susanna wants me to consider something new in the spring, a project I'd be co-developing rather than just translating, working with a French literary estate on a series of letters that haven't been published. Editing, contextualizing, co-authoring the framing material." Priya looked at her. "That's a different scale of work." "Significantly. It would put my name on the book rather than in the translator's note." She said it without false modesty, which was something she was still consciously practicing. "It's a good project. Susanna thinks I'm the right person for it." "Are you?" "Yes," Amelia said. Not a performance of confidence, just an answer. It felt clean. Priya smiled. "Good." "Victor's therapy is apparently going well," Amelia added. According to Diana's second-hand read of his behavior in the settlement process, which has become noticeably more straightforward in the last 3 weeks. "Well," Priya said dryly, "some good news. It's better for the process. It's also, I don't wish him a difficult life, Priya. I know that might be hard to understand." "It's not hard to understand," Priya said. "You're a reasonable person. You're just also someone who got genuinely hurt by him for a long time. Both things can be true." "They can," Priya agreed. "They usually are." Scarlet Veil posted for the first time in 6 weeks in the middle of February. It was a single photograph. No elaborate staging, no carefully designed tableau of her elevated life. It was a window in what appeared to be an older stone building, with Edinburgh rooftops visible in the gray morning light beyond it, and a mug of coffee on the sill. And the caption simply read, "Starting over, taking it slow." The comments were immediate and divided, some supportive, some hostile, some confused, and Scarlett did not respond to any of them, which was different from how she had previously operated. Amelia saw it because Priya sent it to her, and she looked at it for a moment and felt something she recognized as a complicated form of solidarity. She did not send Scarlett a message. They had not been in contact since the January coffee, and that felt like the right distance. Not hostile, but not artificially sustained either. They had been through a specific and unusual thing together and had treated each other with more dignity than the situation required, and that was enough. She thought about Scarlett's comment in the cafe. "You should be angry at me." And her own response, "I don't have the energy for it." That had been true then, but it was more than just energy. It was that the anger she carried was specific. It was for Victor, for the specific architecture of what he'd done. And Scarlett hadn't built that architecture. She had simply been inside it, like Amelia, without knowing the full dimensions. The settlement hearing was scheduled for mid-March. Diana had prepared thoroughly, which was the only way Diana Marsh did anything. The documentation was airtight, Claire Benton's financial forensics, the internal review findings from Victor's firm, the timeline of asset movements rendered into evidence that a judge could follow. Jonathan Kress had signaled through back channels that Victor intended to agree to a figure in the vicinity of what Diana was requesting, which Diana took as confirmation that their position was strong, and Jonathan had finally convinced his client to stop spending money fighting a situation he'd already lost. In the 2 weeks before the hearing, Amelia found herself moving through a kind of anticipatory stillness. Not anxiety exactly, more the sensation of a long journey almost completed, the specific quality of the last hours before arrival. She worked on the Italian manuscript and had a preliminary conversation with Susanna about the French letters project. She had lunch with Henrietta Voss, who had become something between a mentor and an occasional sparring partner over the last few months, and who ordered the sea bass and told Amelia, with her characteristic directness, that she was pleased with how things had progressed. "You've done the harder version of this," Henrietta said. "Most people in your situation want the public moment, the confrontation, the scene. They get the scene and then they're not sure what to do with the aftermath. You did the work first. The scene was almost incidental. It wasn't incidental, Amelia said. No, but it wasn't the whole thing either. The whole thing was everything before it and everything after. Henrietta looked at her across the table. What will you do when it's settled? Work, Amelia said. Move. I've been looking at apartments. In London? In London. A different part of it. Somewhere that's mine from the beginning, rather than somewhere that became mine by default. She had been looking at Hackney, specifically, a neighborhood she had no prior associations with, no map overlaid by old memories. Somewhere she could move through without navigating around the past. Have you found something? A loft in Hackney. It needs work, which I find I don't mind. She looked at Henrietta. I've been finding lately that I don't mind things requiring work, that I actually prefer it. Henrietta smiled, which she did rarely and therefore to considerable effect. That, she said, is the most important thing you've said. Victor called the night before the settlement hearing. She almost didn't answer. She was in the middle of a particularly good page of the Italian manuscript, and her phone was across the room, and she looked at his name on the screen and felt the particular reluctance of someone who has processed a thing as thoroughly as they know how and doesn't want to reopen it the night before a significant day. But she answered. I'm not calling about tomorrow, he said immediately, which was the right thing to say. I wanted to say something before it's done. She waited. I spent a lot of time telling myself you weren't enough, he said. And my therapist keeps asking me what that was actually about, and the honest answer, which I've been avoiding for a while, is that I was afraid you were too much. That you saw things clearly and I didn't want to be seen clearly. He paused. I made myself believe you were ordinary because the alternative was admitting that you were better at being honest than I was, and I found that threatening. The apartment was quiet around her. Outside, the city was doing its nighttime thing, sirens at a distance, the occasional bus. Victor, she said, I appreciate this. I do. But I don't need you to tell me I wasn't ordinary. I know that now. I know you do, he said. That's not why I'm saying it. I'm saying it because I need to have said it. For my own, he stopped. I owe you the acknowledgement, regardless of whether you need it. She thought about that for a moment. All right, she said. I hear you. That's enough, he said. Good luck tomorrow. You too, she said, and meant it in the limited way that she did. She hung up and sat for a moment in the quiet. Then she went back to her desk and read the page she'd been working on before the phone rang. The grandmother deciding, at the end of her long life, that the truth was worth the disruption it would cause, that peace built on concealment is a fragile and exhausting thing to maintain, and she thought it was probably the best page in the manuscript, and she was glad she'd gotten to translate it. The settlement hearing lasted 4 hours. Amelia had expected to feel more during it. She sat beside Diana in the conference room and watched the legal architecture of her marriage being carefully and efficiently dismantled, and what she felt was primarily tired, not the defeated tiredness of someone losing something, but the physical tiredness of someone near the end of a long run, the particular fatigue that comes just before you can stop. Victor was across the table with Jonathan Kress. He looked at her once, at the beginning, and she met his gaze without difficulty, and he looked away first. That was not a victory she tallied. It was just what happened. The numbers were what Diana had argued for. Victor's team had made their final adjustments, which brought the figure marginally below Diana's ceiling but well above the floor, and Diana had recommended accepting, and Amelia had agreed. The Battersea Holding Company was included, valued properly at Claire Benton's assessment. The apartment, the Kensington apartment she had been living in, which was jointly held, would be sold and proceeds split, which meant she needed to complete the move to Hackney before that process concluded, which Diana said would be 3 to 4 months. She signed her name several times in several places. When it was over, she and Diana stood in the corridor outside the conference room while the final documents were being prepared by the administrative staff, and Diana said, with the clipped satisfaction of someone who has completed a difficult job well, "That's a good outcome." "It is," Amelia said. "The Battersea inclusion was the key. Without Claire's documentation, that wouldn't have held." "I know. Tell Claire I said thank you." "I will." Diana paused. "What's next for you?" "A new apartment," Amelia said. "A new project. The ordinary things. Diana looked at her with the expression of someone who knows better than to describe a life rebuilt from scratch as ordinary. "Call me if you need anything else," she said, and went back into the conference room. Amelia went to the elevator and pressed the button for the ground floor. While she waited, Victor came out of the conference room and stopped a few feet from her. Jonathan Kress was behind him, absorbed in his phone, giving them the professional courtesy of not listening. Victor looked at her. He seemed like he wanted to say something and couldn't find what it was. "We're done," she said. Not unkindly, just fact. "We're done," he agreed. The elevator arrived. She got in. The doors closed. She stood in the small metal box going down, and she felt the weight of what had just concluded settle into her properly. Not grief this time, not relief exactly, just the solid, real feeling of a chapter ending. She had started this process on a cold winter morning with a photograph on her phone and a French novel on her screen, and she had arrived at this elevator with her name on a settlement document and 4 hours of sleep the previous night, and a loft in Hackney she was going to make into something. The elevator reached the ground floor. She walked out into the February afternoon, which was gray and cold and smelled faintly of exhaust and the river. And she stood on the pavement for a moment and let the city do what the city does. Press in on all sides, enormous and indifferent and full of people, none of whom knew or cared about the 4 hours she had just spent in a conference room. She found this enormously comforting. She found the anonymity of it, the sheer scale of a city that contains every kind of story simultaneously and has no particular investment in any one of them. Exactly what she needed. She called Priya. "Done," she said when Priya picked up. A pause. Done? Signed and finished." "Oh, thank goodness," Priya said, with the particular relief of someone who has been carrying a piece of a friend's burden for months and is now permitted to put it down. "Are you all right?" "I'm all right," Amelia said. "Come for dinner tonight? I'll cook." "You never cook." "I've been learning," Amelia said. "I've had time." She started walking toward the tube, moving with the flow of the afternoon crowd. She thought about this Hackney loft, which she had visited 3 times now, and which was full of beautiful light and needed new floors, and had a large window in the main room that looked out over rooftops toward a stretch of sky that would be extraordinary in summer. She thought about the Italian manuscript waiting on her desk, and the French letters project that Susanna had said would be hers if she wanted it. She thought about Gerald and Bea and Priya and Henrietta and all the people who had come into focus during this period in the way that certain people do when a crisis strips away the background noise. She thought about the woman she had been a year ago, sitting at a translation desk in a Kensington apartment, translating a sentence she couldn't quite get right, pressing her palm against the cold side of a bed and not asking herself what the coldness meant. She was glad to know what she knew now, even the hard parts of knowing it, especially in some ways the hard parts. She went down into the tube station and was carried home through the dark underneath the city, and above her London continued its enormous ordinary life. And somewhere in it, a loft in Hackney was waiting, and there was work to do. She cooked badly that night. Priya arrived at 7 to find Amelia standing in the kitchen of the Kensington apartment, with a slightly burned onion situation on the stove, and a recipe open on her phone that she had clearly been only partially following, and for a moment they just looked at each other, and then Priya started laughing, and Amelia started laughing too, and the laughter was genuine and unguarded in the way that laughter only is, when the thing that's been coiled tight in your chest for a very long time has finally released. "I told you I'd been learning," Amelia said. "You said you'd been learning. You did not say you'd been succeeding." "I've been learning to fail better." She turned off the stove. "There's good cheese in the fridge and bread from the bakery on the corner. We can eat that." "That's an excellent dinner," Priya said, and sat down at the kitchen table. They ate cheese and bread and drank wine and talked for 3 hours, not exclusively about the settlement, about Priya's work, about a difficult case she'd been managing for months that had concluded well, about a man she'd been seeing since October, who was, she reported, neither terrible nor remarkable, which she described as an enormous improvement over the alternatives. About Gerald's new novel, which he had apparently told Amelia the entire plot of over dinner and sworn her to secrecy. About the Hackney loft, and what Amelia planned to do with the room that faced east. "I want it to be a proper workspace," Amelia said. "Floor-to-ceiling shelves on 2 walls. A desk big enough to spread things out on. Good light in the morning. Are you going to write in it or translate? Both, eventually. She said it without the hedging she would have used a year ago, the automatic qualifications, the preemptive downgrading of her own ambitions. Susanna's French letters project would have my name on the cover. It's a different thing. It's not just translating someone else's words. It's contributing a perspective. It sounds like exactly the right next thing. It is, Amelia said. I know it is. Priya looked at her across the table with the warm, clear-eyed affection of someone who has watched a person they love go through something hard and come out the other side changed in ways that are net gains, even if the cost was real. I want to say something, Priya said, and I want you to let me say it without immediately deflecting. I'll try. You're one of the most capable people I know, Priya said. Not in the sense of, not as a compliment designed to make you feel better. I mean it as an observation. You've always been, and for a very long time, you were inside a situation that kept redirecting that capability toward managing other people's comfort. Victor's comfort, primarily. His sense of himself. She paused. Watching you redirect it toward yourself it's been something. Amelia didn't deflect. She sat with it, which was its own kind of practice. Thank you, she said. I know that's inadequate. It's not inadequate, Priya said. It's enough. They stayed until almost midnight when Priya called a car and left, and Amelia stood in the kitchen after she'd gone and looked around at the apartment, at the warm curtains she'd chosen, at the reorganized shelves, at the small accumulated evidence of 6 months of reclaiming a space that had never quite felt like hers. In 3 months, it would be sold. Someone else would live in it, would choose their own curtains and rearrange the shelves according to their own logic, and the apartment would become something entirely different from anything it had been. She found she was completely at peace with that. March moved into April with the increasing conviction of London warming up. The Hackney loft became hers on the second Friday of April. She had the keys in her hand by 11 in the morning and stood in the empty main room for a long time before doing anything else, just standing in the light that came through the east-facing window and falling on the bare floorboards, and feeling the particular quality of a place that has not yet been shaped by your presence and is entirely available to be. The move was not elegant. She had hired a small removal company, and the foreman was a man named Darius who had a strong accent she couldn't place and who communicated primarily in decisive hand gestures and occasional emphatic use of the word "no problem," which Amelia found soothing even when there were, in fact, several small problems. A box of books was dropped on the stairs. A lamp she'd had since her graduate student years cracked at the base. The wardrobe from the Kensington apartment turned out to be 6 inches wider than the doorframe of the Hackney bedroom, which required a 20-minute pause and ultimately a different configuration entirely. Priya helped unpack boxes that evening, sitting cross-legged on the floor in the main room, surrounded by tissue paper and editorial judgments about what should go on which shelf. "This can't go there," Priya said, holding up a Catalan dictionary. "It'll be next to your Spanish literature section, and you'll never find anything." "I know where everything is by sense memory," Amelia said, unwrapping a framed print she'd bought in a market in Marylebone the month before. "You know where everything was by sense memory. This is new. You need a system." "Priya, I have been a professional translator for 11 years. I have a system." "Your system is chaos with good intentions." "That's a fair description of most functional systems." They argued about the shelves for an hour and arrived at a compromise that satisfied neither of them, and would, Amelia thought, probably work very well. Around 9 in the evening, they ordered food from a Thai place on the high street and sat on the floor to eat it because the furniture was still in transit configurations and the loft was full of the good chaos of a life being arranged, boxes and books, and the lamp with the cracked base that she'd decided to keep anyway because it still worked. And she liked it. "It's a good space," Priya said, looking around. "It's going to be," Amelia said. "It needs the floors done and the kitchen redone, and there's a patch of damp in the bathroom that needs addressing. But the light is extraordinary, and the shelves I had made are exactly what I wanted, and it's mine." She said the last word simply. Not with the performative emphasis of someone making a point, but with the quiet specificity of someone identifying a fact. "It's mine from the beginning. There's no version of it that someone else chose. Priya nodded. She understood what that meant. Like, the Italian manuscript was delivered to Hargrove Press on the 23rd of April, 2 days ahead of deadline, and Susanna's response was a phone call rather than an email, which was unusual enough that Amelia knew before she picked up that it was good. The third generation section, Susanna said without preamble. The grandmother's chapters. I've been in this business for 22 years, and I've read a lot of translations of Italian literary fiction, and that is some of the finest rendering of interiority I have encountered. The language choices in the grief sequences. Where did you find those? They were always there in the Italian, Amelia said. I just tried not to smooth them down into something more comfortable. The original has rough edges in those sections. I thought removing them would be the wrong choice. It would have been completely the wrong choice, Susanna said. I'm glad you didn't. I'm also ready to talk formally about the French Letters project. I want you on it. Are you ready to talk terms? I am, Amelia said. The conversation lasted 40 minutes. By the end of it, the French Letters project was hers. A collection of correspondence between a mid-century French writer and her editor, never previously published in English, which Amelia would translate, contextualize, and co-author the framing material for. It was the kind of project that put a translator's name on the cover alongside the original authors. It was the kind of project that she would not have believed herself capable of being offered a year ago, which said more about a year ago than about the project. After she hung up, she sat at her new desk, installed against the east wall, under the window, exactly where she'd planned, and looked out at the rooftops and the patch of sky that was, even in April, beginning to show the color of the longer days coming. She thought about the sentence she'd been translating when everything began. She no longer recognized anything, and yet everything felt familiar. She had thought about that sentence many times in the past several months, and she understood it differently at each stage. Standing in her new apartment with a new project and the light coming in, she understood it one more time in a new way. Familiarity is not sameness. The self she was arriving at was familiar because it was hers, had always been hers. But nothing around it looked the way it had. The landscape had changed. She was the same person she had always been, and entirely different from the person she had been allowing herself to be. Both of those things were true, and they didn't contradict. She opened the file for the French Letters project and started reading. Victor's departure from his host committee position at the Aldermore Foundation was confirmed publicly in May, framed in the announcement as a mutual decision to allow him to focus on other commitments. People in his world understood what it meant, which was the point of that kind of language. It communicates precisely what it denies saying. Geoffrey Hale made no public statement, which was also a statement. The internal review's conclusions were not published, which was standard practice, but Diana Marsh had enough visibility into the outcomes to confirm that the findings had not been favorable to Victor's position within the firm. He retained his job. That was one of the things Amelia had thought about, whether she wanted him to lose it, and whether that would feel like justice or like something she was not interested in. What she had concluded, in the months since the settlement, was that what happened to Victor's career was Victor's business, in the same way that what happened to her career was hers. She had not set out to destroy him. She had set out to protect herself and to be seen, and both of those things had happened. The downstream effects of his own choices were his to navigate. She heard about him occasionally, in the indirect way that London passes information through overlapping social networks. Patricia Thorne mentioned at a function in May that he had begun attending a different circle of events, smaller, less prominent, the second tier of the circuit rather than the first. Claire Hooper ran a brief follow-up note in her column acknowledging the firm's internal review without elaborating on its conclusions. From Gerald, who moved in adjacent professional worlds, she heard that Victor had taken on a reduced client portfolio and was spending more time outside London. None of this came to her directly. She did not seek it out. She heard it the way you hear news about a place you used to live, with attention but without attachment, filing it away in the particular part of your mind where former lives are stored. She wished him, on her better days, something close to well. Not happiness, exactly. That felt like a larger thing than she had available for him, but the possibility of it, the way you might wish it for anyone who has done harm and is trying, however imperfectly and belatedly, to understand why. She ran into him once, in June. It was at a small gallery opening in Shoreditch, Not the kind of event he would previously have attended, but then he was living differently now, apparently, in ways that included the smaller and less curated corners of the cultural calendar. She saw him from across the room before he saw her, which gave her a moment to decide how she felt about it. What she felt was something mild and distant, like recognizing a landscape you photographed years ago and then largely forgot. She knew every detail of it and felt no particular pull toward it. He saw her. He looked, for a brief moment, uncertain, the old calculation assembling itself and then apparently deciding against whatever it had previously recommended. He crossed the room. He did it simply, without the charged purposefulness of their earlier encounters. "Amelia," he said. "Victor." He looked at her in the way he'd been looking at her since the gala, with a directness that had replaced the old management, the old performance of perception. Whatever the therapy had done, it had at least stripped the layer of studied presentation from the way he engaged with her. "You look well," he said. "I am well." She meant it completely. "I heard about the French Letters Project. Priya mentioned it. We ran into each other at something." He paused. "Congratulations. That's a significant commission." "It is." "You deserve it," he said. He said it without the weight of apology or the awkwardness of a man trying to rehabilitate himself through compliments. He said it like a fact. "I mean that without any... I just mean it." "Thank you," she said. They stood for a moment in the particular space that exists between people who have shared a great deal and arrived at a place where the sharing is over. It was not hostile. It was not warm. It was the honest, neutral ground of two people who had done what they needed to do and could now, in the small, ordinary moments of a shared city, encounter each other without it costing anything significant. "How's the therapy?" she asked, because it was a genuine question and because she had found, in the months since everything, that she was more willing to ask genuine questions than she used to be. "Hard," he said. "Useful. Both of those things every week, in that order." He looked at the painting nearest them, an abstract piece in deep blues and burnt ochre that neither of them had been looking at before. "She keeps pointing out the difference between the story I was telling and what was happening. I'm getting better at catching myself telling the story in real time. It's slow work." "Most important work is," Amelia said. He nodded. He looked at her one more time, and she saw in his face what she'd been slowly learning to identify over the past year. A man doing the actual work of knowing himself, which is unglamorous and nonlinear and doesn't resolve into anything clean. It was the most human she'd ever found him. "Take care of yourself, Victor," she said. "You too," he said. He went back across the room to the person he'd come with. A man she didn't know. A friend, apparently. Someone he was talking to with the ease of genuine company. She watched him for a moment, then turned back to the painting, which she decided she liked. She found the gallery's owner and asked about it. She bought the painting. It now hangs above her desk in the Hackney loft, which is the right place for it. The French Letters Project occupied her for the rest of that year with the demanding, absorbing quality of the best work she'd ever done. The letters were between Marguerite Solier, a French novelist who had written 4 books in the 1950s and 60s, none of them widely known outside France, and her editor, a woman named Hélène Brock, who had championed her work against significant commercial pressure for nearly 2 decades. The correspondence spanned 30 years and was a portrait of 2 women navigating a professional world that was largely indifferent to them, and doing so with intelligence and humor and a mutual honesty that Amelia found, reading through the originals, almost painful in its beauty. The translation work was the most difficult she had done. French of that period required a particular attention, the formality that contained intimacy, the precision that contained feeling, and rendering it into English that preserved both the historical texture and the human warmth was a problem she worked at for months. Susanna let her take the time she needed, which was the mark of an editor who understood that some things cannot be rushed without being damaged. She talked to Henrietta Voss about it over lunch in September. "There's a line in one of the early letters," Amelia said, "where Marguerite writes to Hélène about why she writes at all. Not the public answer she gives in interviews, but the real one. She says she writes because silence makes her feel as though she's agreed to disappear." She turned her wine glass on the table. "I've been sitting with that for 3 weeks. Because it's true for you," Henrietta said. Because I almost agreed to disappear, Amelia said. For years. I thought I was being reasonable, accommodating, not difficult. I was disappearing and calling it something more flattering. Henrietta looked at her with the steady, unsentimental regard she brought to most things. And now? Now I think about how much I translated in those 8 years and how little of my own thinking made it into the world under my own name. She paused. The framing essays I'm writing for this collection are the first things I've written in my own voice in a very long time. It's uncomfortable still, and also right. The discomfort is the work, Henrietta said. You know that. I do now. Henrietta picked up her menu. Tell me about the loft. Amelia told her about the loft. The floors had been done in June, a warm ash wood that she'd chosen herself, spending more time on the decision than was probably warranted, but feeling that it mattered, that the surfaces you walk on every day have a quiet relationship with how you feel. The kitchen had been redone in July, small and functional and entirely organized around how she actually used a kitchen rather than how a kitchen was supposed to look. The bathroom damp had been addressed. The east wall of the main room had the bookshelves she'd had made, floor to ceiling, organized in a way that Priya still occasionally protested, and that Amelia found both efficient and satisfying. It was, she reported to Henrietta, a good place to work, and also a good place to be when she was not working, which was a distinction she was still learning to make properly. The line between the productive use of time and the replenishment of it, both of which turned out to be necessary, which was news to a person who had spent a decade filling her hours as a form of management. You're learning to be still, Henrietta said. I'm learning to be still without it feeling like failure, Amelia said. They're different things. Yes, Henrietta said. They are. In October, Hargrove Press sent her the jacket design for the French Letters collection. Her name was on the front cover, below Marguerite Solier's, edited and translated by Amelia Hart. She looked at it on her laptop screen for a longer time than she would admit to anyone. Then she emailed Susanna to say the design was excellent and the font choice for her name was perfect, which Susanna replied to with a single word, good. She printed a copy and put it on the refrigerator, which she knew was slightly ridiculous and did anyway. Priya came over that evening and saw it and said, without any preamble or ceremony, there it is, and Amelia felt something in her chest that was straightforward and uncomplicated and good. There was a launch event scheduled for February. Susanna had plans for a small literary evening, readings, a discussion, the kind of event that Hargrove occasionally organized for books, it considered worth the effort. The guest list would include people from the literary world, journalists, editors, some of the academic community that Marguerite Solier had begun to attract since her rediscovery. Amelia was expected to speak, which would have terrified her a year ago, and which now felt simply like something she needed to prepare for properly. She started preparing. There are things that stories are supposed to say at their endings, that the protagonist has healed, that everything makes sense now, arranged into a narrative with the clean logic of consequence, that the pain served its purpose and is now over, that you walk out the other side improved and sorted and ready. The true version is messier than that, and Amelia would be the first to say so. She had nights still in the Hackney loft, when the grief came back in the specific and unreasonable way that grief does. Not for Victor, not anymore, but for the years. For the woman she'd been in that Kensington apartment, pressing her palm against a cold sheet and choosing not to ask what the coldness meant. For all the things she might have made and said and done if she had understood sooner that her own sense of her worth did not require his validation. Those nights were real, and she no longer tried to manage them into a more flattering shape. She let them be what they were. And in the morning, she got up and made coffee and went to her desk. She thought sometimes about what B had said over dinner. You know exactly what you seem like, you just don't trust it yet. She thought about how long it takes to trust something that contradicts a story you've been told consistently for years. She thought about all the people who were living inside versions of that same long process of renegotiating their own self-understanding. And she thought about them not with pity, but with the particular solidarity of someone who knows the terrain. She thought about Scarlett, who was posting again from Edinburgh with a different quality to the content. Less curated, less aspirational, more honest in its smallness. A photograph of a rainy afternoon. A bookshelf in progress. a coffee that had gone cold while she was reading. Getting there, she had captioned one post without specifying where there was, and the comments had been mostly kind. Amelia had not reached out, but she had felt something watching the gradual reassembly of a person that she recognized. She thought about Victor in his therapy sessions, doing the slow and unglamorous work of understanding why he had built his life the way he'd built it. She thought about this man she'd run into at the gallery, quieter, more direct, less managed. And she thought that people are capable of change when they've been forced to see clearly enough, and that this is both more and less reassuring than it sounds, because the clarity usually has to be forced. She thought about Marguerite Solier writing to Hélène Braque from a small apartment in Paris in 1954. I write because silence makes me feel as though I've agreed to disappear. She thought about the women who had spent their lives making things under conditions that were less than ideal and often hostile, and who had made them anyway, and whose words had survived them, and who were being read now by a translator in a Hackney loft on a gray October morning with coffee going cold beside her keyboard. She thought about what it means to take up the space you're entitled to, not more, not as an act of aggression or a point to be proven, just the space that is yours, used fully, used honestly, used without apology. This was what she had been learning, she thought. Not how to win against Victor. That had been a necessary battle, but not the central one. Not how to transform herself into someone unrecognizable, but how to stop minimizing the person she had always been. How to stop performing smallness as a form of accommodation. How to say, this is what I think, and this is what I made, and this is who I am, without the reflexive qualifier, the preemptive downgrade, the instinctive bracing for someone to disagree. It was not a lesson you learned once. It was a lesson you learned every day, in small increments, against the long habit of the opposite. Gent. She finished the first draft of her framing essay for the French Letters collection on a Tuesday morning in November, when the light through the east-facing window was low and golden, and the city outside was doing its autumn thing, leaves on the Hackney streets, the smell of wood smoke from somewhere, the particular muffled quality of November sound. She read it through once. Then she closed the document and sat back in her chair and looked at the rooftops visible through the window, the patch of sky above them, pale blue with the white trace of a high contrail going somewhere. The essay was about two women who understood each other clearly and said so honestly over 30 years of letters. It was about what it means to have someone in your life who sees what you're capable of and names it, and what it means to work without that, and how the work finds a way regardless if the person doing it is stubborn and committed enough to keep going. It was about the particular bravery of making things in a world that will frequently tell you not to bother. It was also, she knew, though she had not written it this way explicitly, had not wanted it to be confessional or self-regarding, about herself. About the essay she was writing and the translation she had finished, and the gala and the apartment and all the preceding and following months in which she had done the work of becoming the person she had been all along without the obstruction. She called Priya. "I finished the essay," she said when Priya picked up. "Is it good?" "Yes," Amelia said. "It's good." She said it the way she had been learning to say true things. Simply, without decoration, without the hedge. "Come for dinner," Priya said. "I'll cook. You'll eat whatever I make without complaining." "I never complain." "You make a face." "I make a thoughtful expression." "Come at 7, Priya said, and hung up. Amelia looked at the essay on her screen for another moment. Then she saved it, closed the document, and opened Susanna's email thread to let her know the first draft was ready. Outside the window, the November light was moving the way it does at that hour, deepening slightly, changing the quality of the shadows on the rooftops, making the sky the particular shade of pale winter blue that she had always, even in the worst of the preceding year, found beautiful. The city spread beyond it in every direction, enormous in particular, full of ordinary, extraordinary lives going on in every combination, hers among them. She sent the email to Susanna, put on her coat, and went outside.